For your ears only for the week of August 4th, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Axelberth.
He's still up for 136 years. The substantive aspect that a alleged journalistic source, pure in their motives as far as there are any allegations for, who received no financial payment, has been now convicted of 5 counts of espionage. That is absurd.
I realize you have to have a certain amount of trust, but don't you have people double-checking what somebody's doing?
We do, sir.
Who double-checked Mr. Snowden?
Well, there are checks at multiple levels. There are checks in terms of what an individual might be doing at any moment in time.
They obviously failed.
Journalists and civil libertarians last week celebrated the acquittal of PFC Bradley Manning on the potential death penalty charge of aiding the enemy with his largest ever leak of military and State Department secrets. But the recipient of those 700,000 documents, Julian Assange of WikiLeaks, focused on the lifetime Manning could still spend behind bars for espionage meant to aid the American people's understanding of war and diplomacy in the age of terror. Equally absurd, as Vermont's Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy stressed in questioning Chris Inglis of the National Security Agency, was the ineffective oversight of contractor Edward Snowden before his leaks on the surprising extent of NSA phone and Internet surveillance.
Snowden's leak has prompted growing agreement on the left and right that such monitoring should be more limited or at least more transparent. At least until last week's dramatic reminder of the continuing terror threat, suddenly so imminent it triggered a worldwide travel warning and closed U.S. embassies across the Middle East and Africa, perhaps through the month or beyond. Snowden's grant of at least a year's asylum in Russia last week also threatened a scheduled summit between Presidents Obama and Putin next month. To consider these and related issues for your ears only, we're joined again by Howard University Law School professor Morris Davis, the former Air Force colonel who resigned as chief terrorism prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay. Welcome back to our program.
Well, thank you for having me.
You talked last week about government overreach in charging Manning with aiding the enemy under a Civil War-era statute. Is it ironic that being found not guilty on that charge has actually become the silver lining in this case for journalists and civil libertarians?
I suppose I'd look at it as, half a loaf is better than none at all. It was disappointing that the government brought the charge to begin with. It was equally disappointing when the military judge declined a defense motion to dismiss the charge, but heartening that she found that the government's proof was lacking and acquitted him. His case was not a death penalty case, but he was looking at life without parole.
How much less a chill is still out there for potential whistleblowers and the reporters who may be jailed for not testifying about the leaks they get?
I'd say it's maybe slightly less. I mean, it's kind of like a disease. I mean, this was espionage and aiding the enemy are offenses that have been on the books for decades. But until the Obama administration, they were rarely, if ever, used. And then suddenly we've had this proliferation of prosecutions for espionage and then private manning for aiding the enemy. So I think for journalists and potential leakers, you'd prefer to be told that you're immune from the disease. But at least with the acquittal, it seems that the risk is perhaps a little less.
What does it say about high-level U.S. government security that low-level people like Manning and Snowden could obtain such broad access to sensitive material?
Well, I think it's just an outgrowth of this proliferation of this state of fear that we've lived in since 9/11 and the increasing amount of information that the government is collecting, ostensibly in the name of national security. And when you have that huge, vast quantity of information, it takes, hundreds or thousands of people to manage and utilize that information, and you end up with people like Private Manning and Edward Snowden that, as you mentioned, are pretty far down the pyramid that have access to, what I think for the public ought to be a breathtaking range of information that the government is collecting on each of us.
Where do you come down on the necessity and constitutionality of the NSA's broad surveillance of domestic phone call data?
I think it's unconstitutional. I mean, it turns things on its head. Typically you have a search and then a seizure. So, for instance, if there's information that someone is selling drugs out of a house, you get a search warrant from a judge, which is kind of the broad scope. You've got the warrant to search the house, and then if inside the house you find evidence of drugs or weapons, you seize the evidence, which is a smaller piece. Here, the government is seizing everything on the theory that at some point in the future there may be a need for a search for the specific information. So it's the exact opposite of the normal scenario. And I think the government or the public has just been grossly indifferent. I think since 9/11, we used to be the land of the free and the home of the brave, and since 9/11 we've been the home of the constrained and the cowardly, where we've given up our liberties and ostensibly for security. I think prior to 9/11, the public would be out in the street with pitchforks with the thought of the government collecting this vast array of information on each and every one of us.
But with the speed that data and therefore conspiracy can move in a digital age, is there some compromise between the classic standards that you mentioned and the necessities for trying to get ahead of plots that are hatched on the internet and in other electronic ways?
Yeah, I think there should be. I think there ought to be a discussion, and we seem to be having that discussion now, but we wouldn't be having it but for Edward Snowden, which I found it interesting. President Obama said he welcomed the debate on this important issue, but he also wants to prosecute the guy that made the debate possible. But I think there is that balance to be struck between security and civil liberty. It seems the pendulum had swung way too far to the security side, to the detriment of liberty, and I think we need to have a discussion and decide where a reasonable balance is.
There's also controversy about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that authorizes more intrusive government monitoring and investigation, with sitting judges from other courts, all now mostly Republicans, chosen by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Is there enough independent oversight there?
I don't think there is. I'm involved in a lawsuit that's been going for about 3.5 years where I was fired by the government for writing an op-ed critical of the Obama administration's Guantanamo policy. And the judge that's hearing my lawsuit and has been involved for the last 3.5 years is also the chief judge of the FISA court. So it's a bit concerning. My case involves me criticizing a government terrorism program, and the judge is the judge that runs the government's terrorism court. And as you mentioned, the judges are appointed solely by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court without any congressional involvement. Other federal court appointments, Congress has to approve. So we're giving a lot of power to one man in the Chief Justice and a court that operates completely in secret. So again, I think that ought to be concerning to Americans, the amount of power being exercised in secret by that court. And you've seen the records where there have been thousands of government requests, warrants that went before the court, and I think you can count on one hand the number that have been declined.
Thank you, Professor. Howard University Law School Professor Morris Davis is the former Air Force colonel who resigned as chief terrorism prosecutor at Guantanamo Bay.
Quote from the news, "Restoring democracy. The military did not take over, to the best of our judgment, so far." That was Secretary of State John Kerry on the Egyptian army's role in ousting President Mohamed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, which continues to protest for his reinstatement. Kerry also forecast an end sometime soon of U.S. drone attacks in Pakistan as, quote, "We have eliminated most of the threats."
Next, lessons for and from bankruptcy in Detroit, for your ears only.